Developers, share this video with your designers. Designers, share this video with your design team, because if your designs do not look like this, then you are doing something wrong when it comes to developer handoff. So welcome to the masterclass on prepping your designs with Dev Handoff. We're going to cover annotations, mapping our design tokens, mobile optimized variants, and so much more. Let's rock and roll. One of the biggest mistakes I see designers making when they're prepping their designs for developer handoff is not speaking the same language as their developers in their annotations, and really just leaving really vague notes at the top of each page, just documenting any key functionality. That is absolutely not what you do not want to do. There's actually a ton of different annotations that are going to speak the language that your developers are speaking, and we're going to review all these together, starting off with our button and link annotations. Now, for this exercise today, all the stamps and the annotations that I'm going to be using are from the CVS Health Web Accessibility Annotation Kit. I'll put a link for that in the description. One of the best free and most underrated Figma resources there is out there. So let's start off by looking at the difference between buttons and links and how a developer is going to look at this differently and how to communicate what is what for your developers. So say you have these button components here. A developer is going to realize that these are button components, and you're of course going to realize that these are button components too, whether it's a button or a button icon. But when they're actually translated into the UI itself, a developer is going to ask, are these button components actually buttons or are they links? Because there's actually a difference between the two when it comes to code. And these UIs here, these are courtesy of Untitled UI, one of my favorite Figma kits. I'll put a link for that in the description as well. Jordan did an absolutely amazing job with that. So let's look at an example here. So with this vendor breakdown graph, this view a full report button, is this going to take me to another page where I can view a full report on the UI itself, or is it just going to download the PDF of that report? These are questions that your developers are going to be asking. Even if you do have a page for view full report, a developer is still going to be asking, okay, is this going to download a PDF of the report, or is it going to take me to that page? This is why it's super duper important to be super explicit in terms of your buttons and calling out specifically, are they buttons or are they links? So let's say for this example, this view full report button is actually going to download a PDF of that report for that vendor breakdown. So what I can do is go into my web accessibility annotation kit, pull in a button stamp. Let's set that to above, and I'm going to signify this to my developers that this here is a button. Now, when I've taught this in the past, I tend to see designers just leaving it at this. They just signify to the developers that this is a button. But we still need to speak their language a bit. And there's actually these button details associated with the Web Accessibility Annotation Kit, which goes into much more in-depth detail that a developer is going to be asking. And let's take a look at that next. Okay, so next look at the button details. Now, one thing I would like to call out right away is complete this with your developers, review it with them. Do it first, send it to them, do it together. With a lot of these annotations, there are some more technical elements that you probably, or you might not have a solid insight into. So it's always best to complete these annotations with your developers so that they can ask questions, you can ask questions, and to make sure it is the most accessible design available. So right away, I'm calling out that this here is a button. So I can see that the element is a button, but this button needs an accessible name. Now, if you're visually impaired, you're likely going to be using a screen reader in order to navigate through different websites. So that screen reader is going to need to know the name of this button. So in the case of this here, this accessible name could be, maybe just view full report. View full report. Okay. But for those who are visually impaired, they might not have a solid visual of this vendor breakdown. So they might not fully understand what this button is going to do. So that's why it's also really important to then add a description. So in terms of the context of a screen reader, the accessible name is going to be read first, and then the description is going to be read after the accessible name. So this description is going to be just providing a little bit more details into that view full report button. So let's just put in a sample description here. So downloads PDF of the vendor breakdown report. And again, with your descriptions, I'm going to be a little bit vague here just for the purposes of this exercise and just for time purposes, but try to be as in-depth as possible in your wording so that there is no confusion for someone on a screen reader, so that they have so that they know exactly what it is that this button is going to do. So the accessible name, view full report, the description, downloads PDF of the vendor breakdown report. Okay. So we have our accessible name and we have our description out of the way. Next, what we need is type. Now, this is something where it's best to complete with your developer itself. Type can be something like submit. It can be reset. So work with your developer on that type attribute itself. So hopefully we have a pretty good understanding as to how we can communicate the accessible name, the description, and also the button details for our developer. Next is to look at the link. Okay, so hopefully we have a pretty good idea now as to our button details. So providing our developer so that they can code these into the designs, the accessible name, the description, and also so that the developer has a pretty good understanding of the type attribute as well. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a link. So again, in the term difference between, from a developer standpoint, the difference between a button or a link is a link's going to take you somewhere, but a button has an action, regardless if they are the exact same design component, which in this case is going to be a button. So right next to the view full report that we had already signified as a button, maybe this upgrade plan is actually going to take me somewhere. So developers, go in the context of a developer looking at this, they're going to say, okay, it's a button component, but what this actually should be in code is a link. So I'm going to go ahead and pull in my link stamp, set that to right, and then just mark that on my designs so that my developer, when they're looking at this, is going to know that it's a link. Let's then pull in our link details. So we can see the element is an ahref as intended, and now let's add some of these elements here. So let's add the accessible name and also the description, and we'll cover this same window property to start. So right away, you can see that the same window is selected. When I toggle that off, it's going to specify that the target is actually going to be in a new window. So this is where, again, this is a question that your developer is going to be asking. If I hit this link, should the page open in a new window or in the same window? Should it open in a new tab or the same tab? Like, these are questions that your developers are going to be asking. And for a developer looking at designs, they're not obviously going to be able to understand what is what. Now, if I hit same window, I can see it's the same window, and then I get asked whether or not it is a jump link. So if I hit yes, it is a jump link, it's going to say to the section of the page. Now, this is where it's pretty important to have the conversation with your developers around the format in which they want these. Oftentimes, what I do see is developers doing this. So section of the page, and then enter in the landmark name, which we'll get to a little bit later on in this video. If I turn off, it's the new window. We can leave that as is. Or if it's the same window and it's not a jump link, so same window, but then the desired page. So and then desired page URL, desired page URL. So have the conversation with your developers. Again, these are just different ways that I've seen this implemented in the past. Review these detail cards with your developers so you can come to a mutual understanding as to how your developers want the important information communicated. So that's the target. So really just specifying where it's going to go. Is it the same window, a new window, same tab, new tab, if it's a jump link or not. Next, let's go ahead and look at, so it's going to remove that for now. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and look at the accessible name. So maybe with the accessible name is also going to be upgrade plan. And then let's add a description. So very, very similar to what we did with the button. The accessible name is going to be read first in a screen reader, and the description is going to be read second. But this is information that your developers are going to want to know so that they can build the most accessible design possible. So let's add a target. So in this case, it's going to be takes you to a payment page, or a page where you can select plan to upgrade. So something like that. Again, not the best description. This is where you'd probably have to have that conversation with a content designer and your developers in order to make sure this description is as clear as possible. But again, this is just an example. So hopefully now we have a pretty good idea between the difference between a button and a link and the types of annotations that our developers are going to want to know in order to make the most accessible design possible and to avoid any changes in their code in the future. So we have our button details, we have our link details. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to start looking at some different annotations. Next, look at our heading annotations. Whenever I teach this topic, whether it's in a lecture or a university class or wherever, even working with our design system clients, this is one that always shocks the design team because they generally think that the heading is just a heading. But in code, it can actually be translated a little bit differently. So what I have here is just 3 simple examples. So I have an H1, I have an H2, and then I have an H3. So if these are together in a logical structure, this here, of course, would be a 1. This here would be an H1. This here would be an H2. And then this here would be an H3, right? So you wouldn't need a ton of necessarily, details associated with this. So not much we would need to communicate to our developers. But designs don't always work in the most straightforward way. So you don't always go from an H1 to an H2 or to an H3. What if you go from an H1 to an H3, right? What happens then is that the screen readers in the code are going to be looking for the next H2. So when they don't get an H2, they're going to search to find that H2. So say we take our H1 like this, and then we take our H3. So maybe you have an H1 as a heading, and right below it, you have an H3. In code then, this needs to be an H1. In code, this then needs to be an H2, regardless if this is an H3. So I'm going to bring in our heading stamp here, set this to a 1, and then set this here to a 2. Because one follows after the other, because the screen reader is going to be looking for the next H2. So again, even if it's an H3, we now need to set this as an H2 in the code for it to be read properly by your screen readers. Again, these are things that your developers are going to be asking about. And in the context of the UI that we were just working on, let's look at a quick example. Okay, so in the context of this UI that we were working on here, what we have, this welcome back Olivia text. This here is an H4. And then all the other subheadings underneath it, are H5s. So screen reader is going to be looking for an H1, and you can't just go all the way to an H4 just like that, right? So in the code, despite this being an an H4, we now need to signify that this is actually going to be an H1. And again, this is where things can get really confusing. So be sure to have these conversations with your development team. So this here is going to be an H1. And then let's bring in this. There we go, just like that. And then these here are going to be our H2s, our H2s, our H2s. And then one more on the other side for our H2s. Set that to right. And then there we go. There we have another H2. So a developer looking at this design is instantly going to be able to know that despite seeing that these sizes here are H5s in the code, they need to be communicated as H1s and H2s. Okay, next let's look at our image annotations. Now, any developer is going to look at this and say, okay, this here on the right is an image, but there's still more information that we would need to add. So, let's set that to the right. There we go. So we're going to mark this as an image, of course, but we need to communicate a couple things to our developers. So let's pull in our image details. And the first thing we need to add is alt text for this image. Now, a mistake I often see designers making is just being as vague as possible with alt text. So in this case, they might just put whiteboard with windows. But if I'm on a screen reader and I can't actually see this image, that doesn't actually tell me a whole lot. So it's best to base your accessible names for your alt text for these images and tie it as closely as possible to base it off of what that page is actually about or what that module is actually trying to convey. So in the case of this UI block here from Untitled UI, it looks as if it's an agency. So 400 projects completed, 600% return on investment, something like that. So let's then, for the accessible name, instead of just whiteboard with windows, it looks as if they have some type of planning. So planning whiteboard with schedule for the next week of a very busy design agency with plenty of clients. So that's an example as to the level of detail you should go in depth when it comes to these alt text and these accessible names for your images, and not just keep it as vague as possible. Now, one thing as well, don't forget to add in that element, whether or not is it an image, an IMG or an SVG. And then also additional details about this image. Now, you can just add more details about the image itself, but this is also where you can add things like, is there a max width for the image? Should it expand outwards and then stop at a specific point? And then once it gets beyond the guardrails of that image itself, do then the sides go white, or does it keep filling up that container? So that's where you can add a little bit more details about how the image is supposed to respond in responsive design. So in terms of your annotations, images tend to be a little bit easier more than the other ones, but hopefully now you have a pretty good idea. So next, let's look at our input details. Our input details are a little bit more complex than anything else. So to start off, we have this type. So because this input is just last names, you're actually just putting in text. You're just going to put text. If it's a numeric field, you can put numeric. Again, have the conversation with your developers when it comes to type. Required, true, if it is required, false, if it is not required. Autocomplete, what this is going to be telling your developers, if there should be an autocomplete function that's with it, if it brings up, most commonly suggested, most commonly asked items, most commonly entered items, or just going like alphabetically in terms of autocomplete. That's where autocomplete comes in handy. Input mode, this is something that's rarely actually implemented in designs. So your input mode, if it's text, what would happen then is that the user's on a mobile device, what should actually happen is have like the full text keyboard pop up. But if the input mode is numeric, a number-only keyboard should pop up. So it actually saves the user from having to open up the regular keyboard and then select the numbers. So again, that's one that's generally missed in designs, but again, super, super important in terms of your annotations for Dev Handoff. Now, size. This is not referring to the size of the component. This is referring to the size of like the number of characters that would go into that field. So if there's supposed to be 20 characters in that field, I as a developer would need to know that I should code this in a way that those 20 characters are always going to be showing. Max length. So is there a max length? Again, this field might not be able to go over 25 characters. Min length, maybe you need to have more than 3 characters for just compliance purposes. That use case is up to you. The title of the field, what I tend to do for the title is really just put it to whatever that label for the title is, which in this case is last name. But if you don't have one there, what I tend to put is just what that label would be for the title. Because again, this helps with some of those screen reader type accessibility functions in the code. And then disabled. So am I able to enter any details in this field or not? So again, that's covering the input details at a high level. And with input details, it can be pretty complex. So be sure to have a conversation with your developers around the different input details when you're working with these fields. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to look at our landmarks. Now, your landmarks help a screen reader identify and in the programmed into the code what are the most important sections of the website, of the dashboard, so on and so forth. Now, a great example for this is a recipe page, and it's so blurry just because I used a screenshot tool. It's a really long page, so that's just why. But whenever you have a recipe page, you always have the title. You then tend to have, the descriptions of like how it came to be. It was a family recipe, and you sort of have this real like placeholder content. And then at the bottom, you tend to get into sort of like the heart of the action, like the recipe itself, prep time, equipment, ingredients, so on and so forth. Now, you can imagine how annoying it would be if you're visually impaired on a screen reader if you just want the ingredients and you just want, the ingredients, the recipe, how to cook it, but you have to go through all of this content first. A landmark helps you better identify in those navigating as programmed into the code. What are the more key, most important sections itself? So let's look at a couple examples here. So let's bring in our landmark details, set that to right, our landmark stamp, and then our landmark details here. There we go. So maybe this first element here, this element is going to be our main element. And now the elements, sometimes they confuse me a little bit. So again, just be sure to check with your developers. I'm not perfect. So this is going to be our main element. And then we get into our accessible name in the role. Now, the accessible name is the identifier for this element. So this would be recipe title, I don't know, something like that. And the role is its specific purpose. So start of the article itself. Again, not the best example, but hopefully you get the idea. So you have the identifier and then you have sort of like the description of it. And it's called role in this use case. Then as we scroll down the page, what do we notice? So we have all these different sort of subtexts, like what is it? That's not really sort of useful information. So then let's bring these down. Maybe all of a sudden we want to get to the actual details itself. So then we have the tips. Then we have the recipe itself. So this here then usually becomes a section. And then this here is the recipe. So this here is the recipe, start of the recipe details. There we go. So then as we scroll down, we can then have other ingredients itself. So we can even have one for equipment. We can have one for ingredients, but I tend to like just ingredients and instructions for this use case. So ingredients, oops, I spelled details wrong, details. And then ingredients, required ingredients, and if I can spell this right, for this recipe. And then we have our instructions. Let me extend this out this way. And then we also have our instructions. So there we go. Should be up a little bit further, but I'm kind of running out of room here, but ignore me. There we go. So then this here would be also becoming a section. And then this here is our instructions with the role being how to cook this recipe, this recipe itself. So that's why landmarks are super important. And again, be sure to label them properly as well, so the developers can code this into the code. So one, this is 3, the other one is 2, 3, and then 4. So in this case, maybe we have 4 landmarks that are read by the screen reader. So users will be able to navigate and jump to these landmarks accordingly. Okay, next what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at our focus order. Now, for this, I'm going to demo it first, and then that will just help explain it a little bit better because I can't do it on Figma. I'm using a bank website because banks tend to do this pretty well. So your focus order is the order in which a user would be able to navigate your application or your website by only using the tab key. Those who are visually impaired tend to do this, so they use the tab key instead of a mouse or a trackpad in order to navigate through specific items. This needs to be coded into your design specifically. So one thing I always tell designers and developers that we're working with to build design systems, to build websites, to build apps, whatever it is you should be able to navigate through your website, your application, only using a tab key. And if you can't, you've done something wrong. So let's look at a quick example here. So I'm just, again, hands off my trackpad. I'm going to be navigating this from tab, and look how the focus of these elements evolves. So I'm going to hit tab once. What's the first thing that's highlighted? It's actually open an account. Then it jumps to login, and then register, and then security guarantee, and then web broker online trading, login, and then register, and then security guarantee, and then it moves me down the page. So now I'm at find a checking account, find a savings account, find a credit card. This is kind of hidden from my frame there, but then we jump into all these other elements. So invest and trade online, personalized wealth advice, today's rates, learn more about plan your move to Canada. So these are all the specific tab order actions that are actually programmed into the code itself. Now, it's super important in order to call these out because a developer is not going to know to go from, before we went from login to register to security guarantee. A developer might think you might want to go from login to login. Right? They might think you might want to skip the register and security guarantee because these are more secondary buttons more than the primary buttons here in green. So that's why it's super important to call this out. Now, one question you're probably asking is the text didn't go into that focus order state. It was only the buttons. That's where we actually get into reading order state. But first, let's look at a real quick example in implementing the tab order annotations into the design that we were working on earlier. Okay, next let's go ahead and implement some of our focus orders into this dashboard design. Now, a common mistake that I do see designers make is they might put view full report first as the first focus order state and skipping over customize and export, with the rationale being, I haven't reviewed the rest of the dashboard yet. How do I know what it is that I'm customizing? How do I know what's going to be on that export? But those details are going to be in your button details itself, remember. So your developers will actually code in these descriptions, these accessible names. So when someone's on a screen reader or another type of device, they'd be able to know what customize and export is. So let's go into our focus order. And maybe what we're going to do is just set the search here to the first. our first. Maybe we might have customize export as the second, and set this to above. There we go. So maybe this one here is going to be our second. And then maybe one more for the third. And then you could jump down to the view full report button and the upgrade plan link. Now, in terms of the focus order details, relatively self-explanatory. It's not like input with a whole bunch of items that you would need to review with your developers. It really is just add more details about this focus order stamp. So if they have any questions, your developers have any questions while they're reviewing your designs, you can put the answers to those questions here. It's just provide a little bit more details in case those developers come back at a later date or it's reviewed by another developer. So really nice and simple. Next, let's look at reading order. Now, this is the order that's coded into the design around what's the order that the different text and the different elements should be read on a screen reader. Now, a lot of designers tend to skip this. And one reason why it's super important not to skip this is a developer might take this module here for this individual card. And of course, these would be the first, second, and third elements that are read. But again, maybe just in the context of this little card here for an individual role, what the developer might code in is put this as the first reading order design, and then the second reading order would be view job. Now, what's the issue with that? The issue with that is the user doesn't yet know what the title is and the details of the job. So why would they then want to view the job right away? So there can be that discrepancy there in terms of the user experience that you want to offer. So what you should actually do is call it explicitly where there could be some confusion around what the specific reading order should be. So maybe you actually want the title to be read first, and then actually this item right here, so the little tag, and this here wouldn't be read. Because again, if a developer is also to take this, they might code this in terms of the reading order as design, product design, or design. So then design there is twice. So what you could actually do if you want to leave out something from the reading order, if the duplicate twice like this, especially once you get into more complex designs, is actually just set that to 0 or remove the number entirely and just add a little bit more details specific to that around like, hey, leave this out in the code from being read by a screen reader. Why? Because then design would be read twice. Again, so just so your developers actually know. So this here would be our first. This would be our second read. And then let's go into, maybe then go into the little description, the 3, and then we go into the 4 element here. So the remote, and then we would have the 5. And then lastly, maybe what's read is the view job itself, once you know all the details. And then this here would be the 6. So your reading order is pretty easy in the grand scheme of things, but hopefully that's a pretty good example as to how developers might confuse what you want read in a screen reader in the code, and why it's so important to actually call out the specific reading order that you had in mind. And lastly, 2 more annotations, which can tend to be what most people are already familiar with. First is your note. So if you do have any more generic notes documenting some of the functionality, maybe something scrollable, maybe something swipeable, be sure to call that out specifically. And then also, pretty rare, but if a frame does not have any annotations at all, be sure to let the developers know that there are no annotations for this specific frame, so they're not kept waiting thinking that annotations are coming. Now, everyone knows that if you have a website or you have a dashboard or you have some type of, full experience, everyone knows that you need to design what that experience looks like on mobile. Your developer is not just going to be able to understand how everything responds to a T. No matter how well you use your max and mins, no matter how well you use your wrapping function and auto layout, there's always going to be some confusion with your developers. So it's always best practice to document that experience on mobile. Then that you already know. But in terms of your individual components themselves, especially in the context of your design system, it's a big mistake. A big mistake that designers often make is not documenting how an experience for one of these components might differ on mobile than it is on desktop. At the same time, it's also a mistake to assume that every single one of your components needs a mobile experience. Let's take a quick look. As a couple examples here, I have these inputs and these buttons. These inputs are going to be exactly the same on desktop as they are on mobile. These buttons are going to be the exact same on desktop as they are on mobile. A common pushback I get to that is, what if I need a smaller button or a smaller input? That's fine, but you might need to use that small button on your desktop, and you might need to use that small input also in a desktop experience. So it's not a mobile optimized experience. So what I always tell designers to do is go into your design system and go component by component, module by module, and look for where an experience might be a little bit different. And all these components here are part of our Build Design System series, so be sure to check that out. So again, look for where there's a notable difference in expected experience on mobile than there is on desktop. And let's take a look at a real common example of that next. A real common example where a mobile optimized variant is best to be documented is a header navigation. Because again, this navigation is going to be completely different on desktop than it is on mobile. Because with a navigation on mobile, it tends to be sort of like that sidebar type menu that slides out. So what you can simply do is add a new variant. So we're going to change property 1 here to size. This here is going to be our desktop. And then this here is going to be, oops, I pressed completely the wrong thing there. And then this here is going to be our mobile. Now, one thing I often see designers doing is actually, instead of having mobile optimized variants, building a completely separate mobile design system. I mean, you can do that. It does create a little bit more of a hassle then, because designers are actually going to have to search for the specific mobile component instead of just simply changing the variant to get the experience. So that's why I actually prefer mobile optimized components more than anything else. And then with the sidebar, maybe that's logo is hidden. And we also have that close. So maybe I'm going to right align that close. And there we go. Maybe I shrink these down so it looks a little bit more like a mobile. I'm going to add a quick fill and maybe just a stroke on that left-hand side, because you think about a sidebar navigation. There you go. So there's just a real quick example as to why it's so important to have mobile optimized variants when you need them, not for everything. Because again, if you just sort of leave this to a developer on their own to translate how this would look on mobile, they might include the logo, but that logo would already be included on the website itself. It wouldn't necessarily also need to be in the sidebar. So that's why it's super important when there is a different experience or different expected experience for a mobile component versus a desktop to build a mobile optimized variant, but only when you need to. So when it comes to your design tokens, this is a topic that I've covered quite a bit. So if you've watched all our other videos by now, I'm sure you're a little bit familiar with our approach. But when it comes to handoff to your developers, one thing you absolutely do not want to do is do something like this. Let's create a new collection. Let's just call it's rename, so there's no confusion, in all caps, what not to do. Is have just raw variables floating around. So like text 1 and then a hex code. Text 2 and then a hex code. I see all the time as well things like text large and then another hex code. Because the developer has no idea of knowing what these individual use cases for and really tracking them back to sort of a parent element. Also, too, let's say you have, and I see this all the time with surfaces, or let's say you have like a surface, 1 and then a button background. And again, these naming conventions are not the best and not what you should be doing. But again, just for the purposes of this exercise, maybe they share the same variable. Well, now all of a sudden you have 2 completely different variable values that share the same hex code. So what you're going to end up running into is you sort of have variables floating around like this in an unorganized way, and putting everything in one collection is eventually you're going to have 250 different variables for all these different use cases, and you're going to run into inconsistencies, and that is absolutely going to drive your developers crazy. So when it comes to building out, whether it's your design tokens in Token Studio or your Figma variables in Figma, of course, there is actually a specific method that you should be following. And one thing, too, that maybe I would like to call out as well, and one thing you want to avoid is token-specific or component-specific design tokens or Figma variables. So having groups, so I put this in a group here just to demonstrate. So if you have a group of variables for your button, and then maybe you might have another group of variables for modals, and then you might have another group of variables for links. And if you think about scalability of your design system, eventually you might have like 100 and 120 plus components depending on the complexity of your design system. Could you imagine how annoying it would be to have to scroll through 120 different components to identify the tokens or the variables that you as a developer, your development team, should be using, or you as a designer should be using? So in terms of what not to do, when setting up your Figma variables and prepping your designs for dev handoff, this is absolutely what you want to avoid. So let's take a look at the proper approach that we use when we're working with our design system clients on setting up their design tokens or Figma variables next. So next, let's look at the proper way to set up your design tokens or your Figma variables so they can be consumed by your developers pretty easily. So what we're covering today is a 3-tier approach to your design tokens. So covering your brand, alias, and mapped collections. I do get a lot of pushback from designers who prefer to use a 2-tiered approach. So just leveraging a primitive and semantic collection. That's totally fine. But your 3-tiered approach to your token architecture just sort of sets you up for success in the longer term, regardless of how large or how small you want to scale your design system. I know it's great with multi-brand. It's great with a number of different use cases as well. And the group who trained me, which taught me everything that I'm teaching you now, they've been building design systems for 10, 20, 30 years, both at the design level and also at the code level. And regardless of how large the enterprise or how complex the design system, the 3-tiered approach always works well. So for just a little bit more work, you kind of set yourself up for success in the long term. But anyways, let's dive in here. So the first collection that we're going to be looking at today is your brand collection, also known as your global collection. And we're not going to be building a full library. If you do want to build a full library, I'll put some links in the description for building a full library, both at the 2-tier approach level, so your primitive and semantic, and also at the 3-tiered approach level that I'm covering right now. And I'll put some links for that in the description. But your brand collection is really just their hex codes in their purest form. So your purples, your reds, your greens. They're not necessarily tied to a specific use case yet. So they're not yet used for text, for icons, for surfaces, so on and so forth. They really are just their hex codes in their purest form. So your purples and their hex codes, your reds, then their hex codes, your greens, then their hex codes. And the way I like to look at my Figma variables or my design tokens is kind of like a tree. And your brand collection are the roots of that tree. So the rest of the tree, so the rest of your design system or tokens cannot grow unless you have a really solid foundation, which is your brand collection. So now that we know what a brand collection is, let's look at a quick example. So now that we know what our brand collection is, let's look at a real quick example. But first, let's build out just a mini color scale that we'll use to translate into our brand collection and then all the way through to our mapped collection later on. So what I have here is just our base UI collective purple. And let's maybe build 3 shades that are lighter and then 3 shades that are darker. Again, just as an example. I'm going to copy this, move this off to the side. And then what I'm going to do is for the 3 shades that are darker, I'm going to place them on a black background. And you'll notice that my page background here is set to white. And it's really important when you're building out your color scales to make sure that your colors all are based off of your default color. So in this case, our UI collective purple. One mistake I do see designers always making is just sort of guessing it. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause you some problems longer term when you realize that all your purples look a little bit different. It'll actually cause your developers then to have to go back, work with you and to go back and then change all of those colors, which is a massive hassle. So it's really important to get your color scales right the first time by ensuring that all your shades are based off one default color. So in order to let that happen, what we do is we use our opacities. So in this case, we have our purple, that's our defaults, and then we're going to maybe adjust our opacities by, let's say, 20. So this is going to be 80, this is going to be 60, and then this here is going to be 40 for now. Let's then do the same going darker. So this is 80%, this is going to be our 60%, and then this here is going to be our 40%. So notice how those shades get lighter and then darker based off the background that they have behind them. Now, one thing you're probably saying is, Kirk, we can't have opacities in our design system. That's right. And that's why we have this second scale to the right here, where we're just color matching. So pulling in the hex code of that color and not the opacity. There we go. Bear with me as I do this. Perfect. So now we have a scale that's ready to be translated into our brand collection. So let's go into our local variables here, into our brand collection, and let's just create a color for purple 100. Now, I like to use our 100 scale, and I'll get to what this is in just a sec, but because it really allows us to, if we do need to add additional shades in the future, it's a real easy approach, and it offers us a real easy way to do so. So in this case, our 100 is going to be our lightest shade, and then we're going to have a 200, a 300, a 400, a 500, a 600, and then a 700. And all of these clean 100 values are going to be off of my base scale, so they all follow that 20% opacity grid. So we have our 100, we have our 200, we have our 300, we have our 400, we have our 500, we have our 600, and then we have our 700. Make sure I didn't make a mistake there, which I totally did. We have our 600, and then we have our 700. So there, now we have that nice clean color scale. Now, one thing I would like to call out here as well is, say I do want to add another shade. So if this here is set to our 60%, and this here is set to our 40%, maybe I want to add one more in between, which is just set to 50%. So let's go ahead and color match. And now let's copy that hex code. And what we can then do is place a 150 value in between. So that really offers us a real easy, so using our 100 scale, it really offers us a real easy way to add additional purple values in the future as we scale up our design system. But anyways, so your brand collection, as I mentioned before, it's just their hex codes in their purest form. Your purples, what are their hex codes? Your reds, what are their hex codes? Your greens, what are their hex codes? We're not necessarily getting into specific use cases yet, which comes in your alias and also your mapped collection that we're going to look at next. We take this purple collection, bring it into our alias collection, and then bring it into our mapped collection. And again, if you do want to watch us build a full variable library, I will put some links in the description for our Build a Design System series. Okay, so next let's look at our alias collection. And this is what designers tend to not really like with a three-tiered approach. They don't really necessarily understand the value of your alias collection. But your alias collection is great for additional theming. You know, maybe you have additional brands that you want to include in your design system. And it's just a little bit more clear in terms of the structures, how you went from your brand all the way through to your mapped collection. But again, if you have any questions with that, feel free to ask on our community forum. But your alias collection is where you really start to define the purpose of these colors. So what are your primary colors? What are your error colors? What are your success colors? A real common example or use case that I see here is for purple, you know, what if you have, or for red, sorry, what if your brand color is red, but then your error color is also red? So those might be two very slightly different shades of red, so two very slightly different scales. So in that case, you know, what's your primary brand color, which is a red, and then what's your error color, which is also a red? So your alias is where you get into that addition, that next level of naming. So we're not necessarily giving these specific individual roles yet in terms of what colors to use for text, what colors to use for icons, but it's more overall, what are my primary scales? What are my error scales? What are my success scales? So let's look at an example of this. So let's go ahead and just into not our what not to do collection, but let's create a new collection for alias here. And then what we're going to be doing, because again, if we think about the UI collective purple, that is our primary color. So very similar to what we did in our brand collection, we're going to name this our primary grouping and then have 7 colors. 6 and then 7, our 200, our 300, our 400, our 500, our 600, and then our 700. And now what we're going to be doing is just connecting these back to our brand collection. So our brands. So where's our brand? There we go. Our purple 100, create our alias. Our purple, you know, maybe we'll skip that 150 for now. Our purple 200, our purple 300, our purple 400. And sorry, one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete our what not to do collection just because those variables are getting in the way. Let's go back into our alias. Our purple 500, our purple 500, our purple 600, and then our purple 700. And that's really it. So what it is really just that additional layer of theming. So connecting our brand collection, which is just purple, and now we're assigning this scale a specific role. So this is going to be our primary color. You would also have a secondary, you might have a tertiary. So again, your errors would be your reds, your greens would be your successes, your oranges or your yellows might be your warnings, so on and so forth. So hopefully that makes sense about your alias collection and its specific purpose. Next, what we're going to do is look at our mapped collection. Okay, so next let's look at our mapped collection, and you can look at your mapped collection as like the leaves of a tree, the branches of a tree, because they branch out to all these different specific use cases and tokens and variables that are actually that everyone sees. So these are the variables that are on your components or that are in your designs. So now that we have all three collections here, again, just as a refresher, so your brand collection is sort of the roots of your tree, setting up your design tokens for success. Your alias is the trunk, which connects the roots to the leaves, and the leaves are what everyone sees, and they branch out into all these different specific, use cases. So with your mapped collection, this is where, so again, these are your use cases. So what are your text colors? What are your icon colors? What are your border colors? What are your surface colors, your background colors? So these are the variables that are actually applied to your individual tokens. Your mapped collection is also where you tend to implement a light or dark mode, whereas your alias collection tends to be where, leveraging your modes, you tend to introduce other brands. So let's look at a real quick example here. So we have our alias collection. Let's now go ahead and create a new collection for mapped. So what I always like to get started with is just really creating a couple groupings here. So maybe we just have one grouping for our text. We might have another grouping for our borders. We might have another grouping for our surfaces. And then we might have another grouping for your icon colors. And these tend to cover the majority of use cases that you would have in your components and that you would have in your design system itself. So your mapped collection can be pretty complex and probably take me about 30, 40 minutes to actually cover a completed mapped collection. So if you do want to build a completed variable library with us for your developers, I would take a look at our Build a Design System series, episode 1, and that's going to cover this really in depth, but I'll just go through this really quickly. So in terms of your text, so you might have a text action color, action. Oh, sorry, I did that twice. So ignore that. I'm going to create a new variable here, always making mistakes. So we're going to have a text action color. There we go. A text action color, which might tie back not to your brand collection, but to your alias collection. So that's where it's really important not to go from your mapped collection back to your brand collection, because you need to have that alias collection in between. Because if you change a color in your brand, you want your alias to also change with it, which will also change your mapped. You don't want to have a different color for your alias than you have in your brand or your mapped. So something really important to call out there. Next, let's look at our surfaces or surface color. Sorry, I'll get rid of the S's at the end. Next, let's look at our surface. You might have a surface action. And one thing that's really important to call out here is you don't need to have a specific use case for all the colors in your alias collection. That's a pretty common mistake I see designers making, is trying to pack their mapped collection in order to have a role for every specific color in their color scale, which totally is not the case. So you might have a surface action. You might have an icon primary, which might be that tie back to our default and our alias. And then you might have, so we have our text action, our icon, a surface, a border, and then you might also have a border action as well. So these are just some real quick examples here. Again, we go through this our mapped collection more in depth in our Build a Design System series. So I'd definitely check that out. But hopefully this offers a really good foundation as to the different types of collections and how to go from your brand collection all the way through to your alias collection, and then bringing these alias values into your mapped collection. Again, when you're working with your developers and building out your design system, it's really important to set your design tokens up in a way which can be easily consumed by your developers, and this approach works just fine. Next, what we have is we actually have this checklist available for download that just covers some of the more basic things that you should be checking for before you mark those designs as ready for dev. So let's cover some of the more basic ones to start. Then we're going to get some of the more complex ones and show you some of the plugins that we use next. So the first thing you should always check for is functional QA. With this, are my designs working as intended? Are they responsive? Do they have the associated properties? Am I able to toggle between different variants? These are all things that you're going to be looking for in your functional QA. So let's go ahead, mark that one as completed. And one thing I would like to call out right away is, although these seem super basic, you would be absolutely surprised about how many times I've worked with designers or developers where it's clear that the designer did not undergo the functional QA. So it's now causing those developers a massive headache because they're either rebuilding components or adding additional functionality to components that were already built. Next, what we have is tokens. Is Token Studio actually applied? Now, with this, it's becoming a little bit less relevant as Figma Variables has caught up to Token Studio and everything that it offers. But sometimes there is a little bit of a glitch in Token Studio, where in Figma, it looks as if that variable is applied, but it's not actually applied in Token Studio, which causes a little bit of confusion with your development team. So if you are still using Token Studio, be sure to check that that token is also applied in Tokens Studio. Next, dark and light mode. Do my designs look as they should on dark mode and light mode? Pretty self-explanatory. Next is, are all my layers named? Now, this one is also super important itself. One thing I often always see is, things like just frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 1055, floating around. You want to avoid all that. And if you look at this component as an example, it's input, there's a label, there's the icon that's labeled, there's hit copy, there's a field. Everything is labeled as intended. So if a developer was to come in here, they would know exactly what these layers are referring to. Also, too, are property names consistent? And what I mean by that, when it comes to your properties itself, let's compare the two of these together. So I can see that I have hit copy. I have character counts. I don't have character count here, but that's okay. Maybe it's not mandatory for this field, but really just making sure that all your property names are consistent across your components, even things like types case as well. So if you look here, all of our variant names are all lowercase, but the property name is all uppercase. So make sure that that's also the same across all of your components, that your variant names are all lowercase, but this is what the approach that we use. If you want to have them all capitalized, that's totally fine, whatever works with you. But in our case, we prefer to have our property names with that first letter uppercase and our variant names all lowercase. So in this case, I can see that we've done a pretty good job in terms of consistency there. So that's one thing to always check as well. And also, that is also the case with your layers too. If we look at our layers for our input, I can see that we have our layers called hint copy, and also too for our text area, that layer is also called hint copy. So just the small things like that you should always check. Next, what we're going to do is actually look at two plugins that we use whenever we're prepping our designs for Dev Handoff. And again, this checklist is available for free to download. I'll put a link for that in the description. So next, let's look at documentation. Sorry, there was one before we get into the plugins. But in terms of documentation, it's not just annotations. And what we have is actually some resources that you can download, again, for free. Be sure to subscribe if you want more free templates like this. And the first is our design token mapping template, where essentially what it is the sheet where you can lay out all of your different tokens. In this case here, with your type scales, what's the style name, the size, the line height, the paragraph spacing, the font weight, any declaration like an underline. So your developers can come in here and just get a good lay of the land, a good picture of everything. Even too, for things like your colors themselves, for your map collection. Okay, what's the token name? What's the light color? What's the darker inverted color? When is this color used? What's the description of that color? So something like this can go a really, really long way in building rapport with your developers and making everything easy for them to consume. And if they do need a sheet to reference when to use something like this goes a really, really long way. Again, just be sure that you update it as your design system changes. The other thing that I like to offer for all my components and also colors as well is this little documentation sheet, essentially just describing the color of the component, any usage guidelines. So when should that color component be used? Any accessibility considerations that the developer should be aware of when working with that color or working with that component. And again, both these templates are available for free. Excuse me. So be sure to check that out. I'll put some links for those in the description. So next, before we mark any design is ready for dev, is we always run our design system tracker. Now, this is a plugin that we built here at UI Collective, and it's meant to identify any components or modules that have an unlinked or detached component style or variable within it that would cause our developers a little bit of a headache. Now, it works best on components and smaller modules. It doesn't work well on overall like massive landing pages or Figma pages itself. It's just something to keep in mind. But I can go ahead and select a component, in this case, this button here, scan this page or scan this frame. So I know it's not using any color styles, but I can see it's using a couple color variables. And what do I notice about these variables is that they're local to this build a design, or local to the file from our build a design system series, which is as intended. And there's no rogue or detached color variables here that would cause our developers a little bit of a headache. Same thing with text styles as well. I can see the text style is local to this this file, and nothing that's been detached that our developers would get confused on. I can then say, let's select this component frame, refresh this again. So I can see that the text styles are all the same. Again, no color styles, but now look at all the different color variables that we're using. I can see the parent library, which is our build a design system file from our build a design system series. And again, nothing that's been detached. So I now know that there's no rogue or missing variables or styles within these components themselves. So let's go ahead. Let's mark this off as completed. And then lastly, we tend to use this contrast plugin in order to check our contrast for our components. It's the easiest plugin to use. It's really just called contrast. And what it allows me to do is select specific elements. So in this case, this button, and I can see a visual of the elements, the foreground and background color, and also see if it passes AA or AAA standards with normal text, with large text, and also for graphics as well. So again, a really, really easy plugin to use when you're prepping your designs or your components for developer handoff.